Lenson.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Screen দেখা যাচ্ছে?
Yes, sir. We can see.
ওকে, আর আমি সবাইকে মিউট করে দিয়েছি, হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু আপনারা আবার মিউট করতে চাইলে আনমিউট করতে চাইলে হচ্ছে আনমিউট করতে পারবেন, ওকে। আর যদি হচ্ছে কারো ক্লাস আমরা কন্টিনিউ করার মাঝে যদি কারো কোনো প্রবলেম হয়, হয়তো বুঝতে পারছে না বা কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকে, আবার যদি দেখতে পাচ্ছে না স্লাইড বা যদি কোনো প্রশ্ন হয়, প্লিজ ডোন্ট হেসিটেট টু লেট মি নো, রেজিং ইউর হ্যান্ডস, একটা হ্যান্ড রেজ অপশন আছে, সেটা চালু করে আপনারা আমাকে জানাতে পারেন, ওকে। ওকে, সো today we will learn the origin of Australian English language. Okay, in this world there are many countries, especially 5 countries, they use English as their first language. England, America, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. Okay, in our previous class we have learned the background of American English and Canadian English, and today we will know how English went to Australia and how Australian English has got their recognition and the standard of pronunciation or accent and everything. So this is so the title of this first session we will be calling that the origin of Australian English language. Original, if we discuss from the very beginning of the origin of Australian English, then we have to go back from the very beginning of the British colonial power. And the British colonial power, at the end of the 18th century, they started to move from the northern part, the upper portion of this map. You see, these are the northern region of the world you move. And from the northern part, the British colonial power started to move from the southern part of this map. And in the map, you see, this is Australia. Okay, so we are discussing the origin of Australian English language. Okay, so at the end of the 18th century, the British colonial power started their journey from the northern side of the world and moved towards the southern hemisphere, that is Australia and the other part. And that happened at the end of the 18th century. And though if we compare that how many English speakers are there in the northern part of this world, northern hemisphere of this world, and the southern hemisphere of this world. So in comparison, in the southern hemisphere, less number of English speaking people live. Okay, but however, the English in Australia got the same characteristics as we see in the stressed pattern and the vocabulary of American and Canadian English. That means the northern part of the world. That means in another part of the world, English language came from Britain, and in the same part, in the same way, English language went to the southern hemisphere of this world from Britain, and that happened at the end of the 18th century. As we have seen in this map, that means the northern part, the people started to move and they went to the southern part of the world. And in this regard, one person, especially in the second half of the 18th century, a person, his name is Captain James Cook. And this is a British, this person is a British explorer, navigator, and cartographer, and the captain in the British Royal Navy. Okay, and this man reached Australia in 1770. Okay, and the first, this British explorer went to Australia in 1770. And when he reached over there, within the 20 years of Captain James Cook arrival to Australia, within the 20 years, British colonial power established their penal colony in Australia. And penal colony we know, and the British people did it to get less pressure in the overcrowded prison in England. That means British at the time, at the end of the 18th century, the British had colony all over the world, and they had prisoners, and they had prison in England. But the prisons of England became overcrowded. And for this reason, to overcome the overcrowding situation of the England's prison, many prisoners, British colonial power established their penal colony in Australia, and they moved 130,000 prisoners within the 50 years of establishing their penal colony in Australia. And apart from these prisoners, there are free settlers. Free settlers, they also came from England, Ireland, and the other part of this world. They also started to come and they settled in Australia. And at that time, the immigration in Australia increased in a large number. And by 1850, that means within 80 years, the population of Australia was about 4 lakhs. And that was happened, that means 130,000 prisoners, they were shifted from England's prison to Australian prisons. Okay. And apart from that, some other people, some other free settlers, they also went to Australia during this time period. That means from 1770 to 1850. So within the 80 years, the population of Australia became 4 lakhs, and many of them are from UK or Britain. Okay, and by 1900 or 1900 years, nearly 4 million people started to live in Australia. So the many of them came from Britain. And in 2002, it was nearly 19 million. So 19 million people started to live in Australia. But the first journey, that means the British explorer, James Cook, he reached over there in 1770. And this man is James Cook. And however, by 1850, the population of Australia became 4 lakhs. And by 1900, the population nearly 4 million, that means 40 lakhs. And by 2002, it was nearly 19 million. Okay, that means 1 crore and 90 lakhs. Okay, so this was the population. And the population who came to Australia, settled there, the most of them came from the British Isles. That means the British Island, which are called the British Island. British Island, that means UK, United Kingdom, Ireland, England, and Wales, okay, Scotland. So the people who had been living in Australia, most of them came from Britain. So the language used in Australia is mainly English language. And especially the many convicts from London and Ireland. And as we have known that within the 50 years of establishing British prison in Australia, nearly 130,000 prisoners was shifted from England to Australia. And apart from that, there was also a revolution that happened in 1798 in Ireland. And in 1798, a revolution occurred in Ireland. And for what? And especially the people of Ireland, they started to fight against the British power or British royal power. And we know that the Ireland is a part of UK. That means British Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. These four countries are the part of Britain. But in 1798, the people of Ireland, they started a revolution against the British government. And what happened then? A French army supported the Irish revolutionists. And what happened that? And nearly 10,000 to between 10,000 to 30,000 people were killed at the time of the revolution that occurred between Ireland and British army. So during this, I said that many people, that means many prisoners, many convicts, they were shifted from England to Australia. And in 1798, for the Irish Revolution, when Ireland was defeated by the British royalists, many convicts, they left London, they left Ireland and went to Australia. And for this reason, a large chunk of people started to use English language. And because they are originally from Britain, so their language is English. Their first language is English. However, one thing is that there is a difference between standard English language and the regional English language. So the prisoner, they are not all had been using the standard English language. And the people, that means the British people who settled in Australia, they are not from a specific region of Britain. They are from the many region of Britain. So they used the English language, but a variation was there in English language. And this variation you can call the regional accent, the regional language they had been using. Okay. And for this reason, we see that Australia became a country of nearly 440 lakhs population. Most of them came from Britain, however, not from a specific region of Britain. And for this reason, many regional English language came to Britain. And as a result, the Cockney accent of London, that means in eastern part of London, a special accent of English language is used, especially the eastern part of London, and also the Brock. And also the regional Irish language. So the Cockney of England, that means the special regional accent of the eastern part of England, and also the regional English language used in Ireland, used by the most people living in Australia. And for this reason, we see the speech pattern of Australian English language are derived from the Cockney of London and also from the regional accent of Irish English language. Okay. However, with the English language, in Australia, there had been the people who are Aboriginal Australian citizen. So they are the old citizen of Australia. So when James Cook came to Australia in 1770, before that, some people had been living in Australia. They are the original Australian inhabitants. So these original inhabitants had been using a different language. So the English language, the British settler, they came up with their language, and apart from the language used by the British settlers, the language of original Australian population mix up with the English language. And with the all variety, the expression we get, that is the, and however, another point is that the influence of American English, a growing number of immigrant groups noticeable in Australia. And thus Australia has a mixed linguistics character. So, and in most part, the British people,
স্যার ওকে কাছে রাখেন।
ও ঘুমাচ্ছিল, ঘুম থেকে উঠে আসলে ও ইয়া শুরু করছে।
এই নানসুন ভাই, কারেন্ট নাই, গেঞ্জি খুলে ফেলছে। কারেন্ট চলে গেছে, গেঞ্জি খুলে ফেলছি আর লঙ্গিটা অর্ধেক আছে।
ভাই কি খবর ভাই?
খবর তো বললাম, সেট হয়েছে।
হ্যাঁ, ওকে, যারা আনমিউট করেছেন মিউট করেন। Okay, thank you. So, আমরা যা বলছিলাম আর কি, যে after the establishment of British colony in Australia by James Cook in 1770, most of the people came from England to Australia. They are convicts, that means they are the prisoner. And after that, many people, though following the revolution between Irish Revolution in 1798, okay, the many people also left England and Ireland, and they went to Australia. So these people had been using not standard English, they had been using the regional English language. Okay, the standard English language that is used by BBC, that is the standard English language or standard English pronunciation. But the people who left England and went to Australia, they had been using the regional English language. And apart from that, the people who had been living in Australia before James Cook in 1770, they had a kind of language. So their Aboriginal language, that means Australian Aboriginal language, mix up with the English language used by the people, that means the convict and the other people, the free settlers, they went to Australia. And also there is a growing tendency of using American English in Australia. So the Australian Aboriginal English accent, the British Cockney, and the regional accent of Ireland, and the growing American English accent. For the combination of these four categories, Australian English language gave a mixture of linguistic quality. That is, and for this reason, Australian English pronunciation is not like the British pronunciation, not like the American pronunciation. For this mixed up, they had a different mixed linguistics accent pattern of Australian, the people of Australia. And then what happened to New Zealand? So if we see, can you see the map?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. This is Australia, okay, and we had been discussing this part, and this is the New Zealand part, okay, and North Island, and this is South Island. This is New Zealand. So what happened to the New Zealand English, okay, and what is the characteristics of the English used by the people of New Zealand? In this regard, the thing that is common, that means at the end of the 18th century, the British settler went to the southern hemisphere of this world. And James Cook also went New Zealand, okay. So in New Zealand, English language started later and moved more slowly. The people of New Zealand, they are called Maori, okay? And their language is also called Maori. Okay? So they had a language. So Captain Cook, that means the Captain James Cook, the British explorer, reached in the island of New Zealand in 1769 to 70, within this year. So he reached over there. And other European whalers and traders settled there in 1790s. That means more than 80 সালের পর থেকে 1770 সালে নিউজিল্যান্ডে ক্যাপ্টেন কুক সেখানে পৌঁছলেন এবং তারও 10 বছর পরে many whalers means the person who যারা তিমি শিকারী and trader, they also went to New Zealand in 1790 decades. And another group, they were the Rabiul. What happened to you? Rabiul is going out and coming. Okay. So Captain James Cook reached in New Zealand in 1770, and after 10 years, the other whalers and the trader, European, they are also European, they also went there in New Zealand. And apart from there, the Christian missionary work, okay, started in Maori from 1814, so nearly 20 years, after 20 years. Okay. So in 1770, Captain James Cook reached in New Zealand. After 10 years, many European whalers and traders reached in New Zealand. And in 1814, the Christian missionary work established in New Zealand. However, the British established their colony in New Zealand in 1840. Okay. And in 1840, there was a treaty. Rakibul Hassan, can you hear me? Rakibul Hassan, can you hear me? Rakibul Hassan,
Yes, sir.
can you hear me?
Now it's okay.
Oh, what happened to you? You are going to waiting room and coming. Every time I get notification that you are going out and coming. Okay, now unmute, okay? Do you have any network problem? রাকিবুল হাসান, আপনার কি নেটওয়ার্কের প্রবলেম হচ্ছে? Okay, so Captain Cook reached in New Zealand in 1770, and after 10 years, the European whalers and traders went over there in New Zealand. And in 1814, the Christian missionary work started in New Zealand. However, the British, they established in their colony in New Zealand in 1840. 1940 সালে তাদের কলোনি এই নিউজিল্যান্ডে স্থাপন করেন এবং দেয়ার ওয়াজ আ ট্রিটি। এই নিউজিল্যান্ডের মানুষদের যে আমি বলেছিলাম যে তাদেরকে বলা হয় মাউরি, অ্যান্ড তাদের ভাষার নামও হচ্ছে মাউরি। সেই 1840 সালে এই মাউরি এবং দ্য ব্রিটিশ ক্রাউন রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভ, ব্রিটিশ পিপলদের মধ্যে একটা ট্রিটি হয়। ওকে, অ্যান্ড এই ট্রিটিটাকে বলা হয় দ্য ট্রিটি অফ ওয়েটাঙ্গি। Okay, as you see in the picture, that means a treaty. The people wearing hat are the British representative over there in New Zealand, and these are the Aboriginal people of New Zealand. So the treaty was signed between the British government and the Aboriginal people of New Zealand. Okay, and this treaty was signed in 6 February 1840 by the representative of British Crown and the Maori chiefs from the northern island of New Zealand. So after the treaty, British people established their colony in New Zealand. And then the increase in European immigration. After 1840, many people went to New Zealand. And around 2000 in 1840, at the time of the Waitangi Treaty between the British people and the people of New Zealand, the Aboriginal people of New Zealand, the European immigrant was only 2000 in numbers. And in 1840 to 1850, that became 25,000. So within 10 years, the immigrant, that means European immigrant in New Zealand, from 2000 to 25,000, and to 750,000 by 1900. So 1900 সালে থেকে এসে 750,000, that means 7.5 লাখ British immigrant New Zealand বাস করা শুরু করে। Okay. And the total population in 2002 was 3.8 million. Okay. So British explorer James Cook reached in New Zealand in 1770. After 10 years, many European whalers and traders went to New Zealand. However, the Christian missionary work established in New Zealand in 1840. But in 1840, there was a treaty between New Zealand and the British government. And the British government established their colony in New Zealand. And within From 1840 to 1850, the immigrant, that means the British immigrant in New Zealand became 25,000, and by 1900s, it became 7.5 lakhs. And in 2002, the population of New Zealand became 3.8 million. So this is the way the people, the British people went to, the English speaking people went to New Zealand.
স্যার
Yeah. Yes.
মাওরি হচ্ছে কি ওই যে নিউজিল্যান্ডের অরিজিনাল সিটিজেন?
হ্যাঁ, নিউজিল্যান্ডের অরিজিনাল যারা জাতি তাদেরকে বলা হয় মাওরি। এরা ওদের yes
ওয়েটাঙ্গি ওয়েটাঙ্গি
ওয়েটাঙ্গি
টাঙ্গি
ওয়েটাঙ্গি এটা হলো একটা জায়গার নাম, যেখানে একটা ট্রিটি হয় 1840 সালে একটা ট্রিটি হয়। এই যে ছবিটা দেখতে পাচ্ছেন, ছবিটা দেখা যাচ্ছে, এই ছবিতে হ্যাট পরা দুইজন যারা আছে তারা হলো ব্রিটিশ রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভ। আর এই যে আমরা সারিবদ্ধভাবে যাদেরকে দেখতে পাচ্ছি এরা হচ্ছে মাউরির চিফ। দে আর দা মাউরির চিফ, মানে মাউরি জনগোষ্ঠীর গোত্র প্রধান হলো এরা। এই গোত্র প্রধানদের সাথে ব্রিটিশদের একটা ট্রিটি হয়, মানে চুক্তি হয়, এবং এই চুক্তির পরেই 1840 সালে ব্রিটিশরা নিউজিল্যান্ডে তাদের কলোনি স্থাপন করে।
তখন মাউরিরা মনে হয় এক কাপড়ে থাকতো।
তা সেরকম কোনো ব্যাখ্যা এখানে দেখা যাচ্ছে না আর কি, তবে মাউরি সম্পর্কে আরো পড়লে জানা যাবে আর কি। এই পর্যন্ত আমি এটুকুই জানি যে হচ্ছে মাউরি হলো নিউজিল্যান্ডের আদিবাসী, হ্যাঁ, এবং তাদের ভাষার নামও মাউরি। এবং আমরা যদি নিউজিল্যান্ডের নাম মাউরি ভাষায় হলো এই যে এটা আও টিয়ারওয়া, হ্যাঁ, এই মাউরি ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজে মাউরিরা নিউজিল্যান্ডকে বলে আও টিয়ারওয়া। ওকে, সো আই নো only this, that the Maori is the aboriginal people of New Zealand and their language is Maori. Okay, so this was the treaty, and for this region 3 strands of New Zealand social history had a special linguistic consequence. When many immigrants went to New Zealand, their English language got a special categories, and because the most of the people living in New Zealand, they are from European countries, many of them from Britain and other European countries. They also had been using English language. And for this reason, we see the New Zealand English language has several characteristics. Okay, first of all, like Australia, a stronger sense of the historical relationship with Britain. If we give an example, that means we use English language. However, this Indian subcontinent, for many reasons, had been ruled by the British. For nearly 200 years, the British people had been ruling in Indian subcontinent. So the English we use naturally has a heritage of or similarity between the British English linguistic pattern. In the same way, the New Zealand English language has a historical relationship with Britain. Okay, just like Australia. অস্ট্রেলিয়া যেমন ইংলিশের ক্ষেত্রে আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি যে অস্ট্রেলিয়াতে যখন ব্রিটিশরা জেলখানা তৈরি করলো, অনেক কয়েদিকে ইংল্যান্ড থেকে নিয়ে আসলো, আবার রিভলিউশনের সময় আসলো, এই জন্য অস্ট্রেলিয়ার অধিকাংশ জনগণই ব্রিটেনদের সাথে একটা রিলেশনশিপ মনে করে যে আমাদের একটা হিস্টোরিক্যাল রিলেশনশিপ আছে। সেই রকম নিউজিল্যান্ডের মানুষেরাও তাদের মনে করে যে ব্রিটেনদের সাথে তাদের একটা হেরিটেজ আছে, লং historical relationship আছে, and a greater sympathy for British values and institutions. And the people of New Zealand, they like the British principles, British rules, regulation, and also they like British institution, because from the more than 300 years, the British people had been ruling New Zealand. So many New Zealand people speak with an accent which displays clear British influence. So the New Zealand English has three types of characteristics. The first type, that means the people of New Zealand, they had a linkage, historical linkage to the British institution. And not only that, the new people of New Zealand love British values, principle, and institution. And for this reason, many people living in New Zealand, they use English language that is quite similar to the standard English pronunciation of Britain. Okay. As we see, in case of the Australian English, we see the mixture of several English language. The matter is that the people went to Australia, they are from England, most of them are prisoners, convicts, and they are taken from the different parts of this England. However, in New Zealand, we see the people of Britain, they went over there, most of them are administrator, they are the affluent administrator, they are the wise administrator, British administrator had been in New Zealand. So the people of New Zealand, they use English language that is quite similar to the British standard English pronunciation. As you see in this map, this is New Zealand. We have talked about that. Secondly, a growing sense of national identity. New Zealand, they had an identity. They love their country. They love their heritage. They love their language, Maori language. Okay, an emphasis on the difference between New Zealand and Australia. So we will not see Australian English has a characteristics. Many people can identify that this is Australian English. Many people can identify this is American English. Many people can also identify the British English. However, we see there is a difference between Australian English and New Zealand English. Why? Because New Zealand had a heritage, and they in order to maintain the national identity of their language, the people of New Zealand, they try to speak standard English language, and that makes a difference between Australian English language. And difference in the accent of the two countries motivate the use of distinctive New Zealand vocabulary and accent. Okay. Any question? Okay. Thirdly, a fresh concern of the rights and needs of the Maori people. Now over 10% of the population, resulted in an increased use of Maori words in New Zealand English. Sharijoan?
Yes, sir.
হ্যাঁ, আপনি হাত তুলেছেন, কোনো প্রশ্ন আছে?
না, প্রশ্ন না স্যার, নামাজের ব্রেক দিলে ভালো হতো স্যার।
হ্যাঁ, নামাজের ব্রেক দিব একটু, আর এই যে শেষ হয়ে গিয়েছে আমাদের।
আচ্ছা, ঠিক আছে স্যার।
ওকে, সো যা সেকেন্ডলি আমরা যেটা বললাম যে হলো যে নিউজিল্যান্ডের ইংলিশ এবং অস্ট্রেলিয়ান ইংলিশের মধ্যে একটা পার্থক্য আছে, এবং এটা হয়েছে এই কারণে দ্য পিপল অফ নিউজিল্যান্ড তারা মনে করে যে আমাদের জাতি এবং এর মধ্যে একটা পার্থক্য আছে, এই জন্য তাদের ইংলিশটা তারা ব্যবহার করে ব্রিটিশ স্ট্যান্ডার্ড ইংলিশের মতো। এবং আরো একটা, যেমন আমাদের বাংলা ভাষার কিছু শব্দ যেমন ইংরেজির মধ্যে ঢুকে গিয়েছে, ঠিক আছে, আমরা যেমন টেবিলের বাংলা জানি না, হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু টেবিল টেবিল বলেই এরকম কিছু বাংলা ওয়ার্ডও এর মধ্যে চলে যায়। সেরকম নিউজিল্যান্ডের যে ইংলিশটা তারা ব্যবহার করে তার মধ্যে মাওরি ভাষার কিছু ওয়ার্ড এই নিউজিল্যান্ডের ইংলিশের মধ্যে ঢুকে গিয়েছে। সেই কারণে আমরা নিউজিল্যান্ডের ইংলিশকে যেমন একদিকে দেখি যে হচ্ছে প্রথম প্যাটার্নটা হলো they use standard English language that makes a difference between New Zealand and Australian English. And another thing that they had, the people of New Zealand had a love for the values of British people, so they try to use standard British English pronunciation. And also in the third category, they use, that means the people of New Zealand, they use some Maori words in the vocabulary used by the people of New Zealand. So uh, in uh, in brief, I can say that the Captain James Cook also went there in New Zealand in 1770, and after 10 years, the whalers and the trader also went there in New Zealand, and in 1814, Christian missionary work started in New Zealand. And in 1840, a treaty was signed between the Maori chiefs and the British government administrative or representative over there. And after this treaty, British people established their colony in New Zealand. And after 1840, the large number of immigrants started to go to New Zealand. And by 2002, the people of New Zealand became nearly 4 million. And most of them are the inhabitants of British and Europe. And for this reason, we see that in New Zealand English, there is a growing tendency of the people of New Zealand that they are tend to use British standard English. Another thing is that for the cause of their national identity, there is a difference between New Zealand English and Australian English. And we also see some words, Maori words in the vocabulary of New Zealand English language. Okay, so thank you very much. If you have, yes.
যেটা বললেন যে অস্ট্রেলিয়ান ইংলিশ মিক্সড হওয়ার কারণ হচ্ছে যে এখানে ব্রিটেনকে যারা গিয়েছিল তারা ছিল প্রিজনার।
হ্যাঁ, অধিকাংশই প্রিজনার। আর শুধু তাই না, ওটা একটা কারণ। আরেকটা, প্রিজনাররা ওখানে গিয়েছিল এবং সাথে সাথে অস্ট্রেলিয়ান কিছু অ্যাবরিজিনাল ইংলিশের মিক্সচার ওখানে ছিল। তারপরে আমেরিকা থেকে কিছু লোক গিয়েছিল। আবার অস্ট্রেলিয়াতে আরেকটাও হয়েছিল যে আমরা যেমন বাংলাদেশের ক্ষেত্রে যেমন চিটাগাংয়ের ভাষা বাংলা ঢাকার ভাষা থেকে আলাদা, সেরকম আয়ারল্যান্ডের যে ভাষা, স্কটল্যান্ডের যে ইংলিশ, দে আর ইউজিং ইংলিশ বাট দে আর কোয়াইট ডিফারেন্ট ফ্রম দ্য স্ট্যান্ডার্ড ইংলিশ ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ। সো কনভিক্টরা যেমন গিয়েছিল, প্রিজনাররা যেমন গিয়েছিল, সেই আইরিশ রেভলিউশনের পরে আয়ারল্যান্ড থেকে কিছু মানুষ, প্রচুর মানুষ, তারাও গিয়েছিল হচ্ছে অস্ট্রেলিয়াতে। সো অস্ট্রেলিয়ান ইংলিশের মধ্যে আমরা দেখব যে প্রিজনারদের ভাষা, আবার আইরিশ যেই রিজনাল ভাষা সেটা, এবং লন্ডনের, ইস্ট লন্ডনের একটা আঞ্চলিক ভাষা, এই তিন ভাষা, অস্ট্রেলিয়ানের যে রিজনাল ভাষা সেটা, পাশাপাশি আমেরিকান অ্যাকসেন্টের যে গ্রোয়িং টেন্ডেন্সি, সেই সমস্ত টেন্ডেন্সিগুলোর মিক্স আপ করেই হচ্ছে এই এর অস্ট্রেলিয়ান ইংলিশের একটা আমরা মিক্সড লিঙ্গুইস্টিক প্যাটার্ন, মানে উচ্চারণ রীতি বা ভোকাবুলারি, এটা আমরা লক্ষ্য করি। ওকে, কে প্রশ্ন করেছিলেন? নাজিমউদ্দিন, বুঝতে পেরেছেন একটু?
ইংরেজির ভিতরে কি মাওরির শব্দ ঢুকে গিয়েছে?
মাওরির কিছু শব্দ ইংরেজি ভোকাবুলারির মধ্যে ঢুকে গিয়েছে। ওকে, যেমন বাংলা ভাষায় আমরা কিছু উদাহরণ দিতে পারি যে বাংলার যে আমরা বাংলা যে ভাষা ব্যবহার করি, এটার মধ্যে অনেক আরবি, ফার্সি, যেমন পানি, এই শব্দটা কিন্তু বাংলা ওয়ার্ড না। এটা কি ওয়ার্ড? এটা সম্ভবত ফার্সি ওয়ার্ড। হ্যাঁ, এরকম বাংলা আমরা যে শব্দটা ব্যবহার করি, ভাষা ব্যবহার করি, এর মধ্যে যেমন বিভিন্ন আরবি, ফার্সি, ওকে, এরকম ওয়ার্ড বাংলা ভাষার মধ্যে এসেছে। সেরকম এই নিউজিল্যান্ডের ইংলিশের মধ্যে